So we talked about type conversion and coercion to numbers and to strings. But I didn't mention booleans yet, right? That's because we need to learn the concept of truthy and falsy values first. And so that's what we're going to do now. So let's get right into it. So falsy values are values that are not exactly false, but will become false when we try to convert them into a boolean. And in JavaScript, there are only 5 falsy values. And let me actually write them down here for you. So 5 falsy values. And they are 0, the empty string, undefined, null, and not a number. And that's it. Of course, false itself is already false, so we don't need to include it in the list of falsy values. So again, all of these 5 values will be converted to false when we attempt to convert them to a boolean. They're not exactly false initially, but they will become when converted to a boolean. So that's the definition of falsy values. Everything else are so-called truthy values, so values that will be converted to true. For example, any number that is not 0 or any string that is not an empty string will be converted to true when we attempt to convert them to a boolean. And so let's actually see that in practice. So just like with numbers and strings, we can use the boolean function, boolean, and then 0. And we know that this one is a falsy value, right? So let's copy this and do this a couple times for some different things. Let's do the same with undefined. Let's do it now with a string. And it's not an empty string. And now let's also do this with this empty object. And we will learn about objects in the next section. So this here is simply an empty object. So let's see what the result of this is going to be. And we see that indeed converting the 0 here to a boolean resulted in false. And the same for undefined. It's also false. But then the string Jonas is true. And so that's why we say that any string that is not an empty string is a truthy value. And the same actually applies to this empty object here. It's also a truthy value. But if we tried to convert an empty string, well, I think then you can already know what the result will be. And it's going to be false. Again, because it's a falsy value, as we see up here in this list. So that's what truthy and falsy values are, and this is how we could convert them to booleans. But in practice, I actually never did this in my life. I never used this function here in practice. This was just to show you the concept of truthy and falsy values. So in practice, the conversion to boolean is always implicit, not explicit. Or in other words, is always type coercion that JavaScript does automatically behind the scenes. But when exactly does JavaScript do type coercion to booleans? Well, it happens in 2 scenarios. First, when using logical operators, and second, in a logical context, like for example in the condition of an if-else statement. And we're going to talk about logical operators in a future lecture, so let's now go back to the if-else statement and see how type coercion works in the if-else condition. So, let's say that we have a money variable. And in the beginning, we don't have any money. So we set it to 0 here. And now we can use what we just learned to test if the person has currently any money or not. Right? So let me actually write it first, and then I'm going to explain to you how it works. So if money, then let's log to the console something like don't spend it all. And notice how I used the double quotes because in here I have a single quote for the don't. And then we can also do an else block. So for the case that the person does not have any money, then I can just say you should get a job. Okay, so let's see if this works, and then I'm going to explain to you why it works. So indeed, we got the you should get a job, and so that's the else part here, right? So this here is the code that got executed. But why? Well, we know that money is a number right now, and this number is 0. But in the logical context of an if-else statement condition, so that's right here in these parentheses, here JavaScript will try to coerce any value into a Boolean. So no matter what we put here, if it's not a Boolean, JavaScript will try to convert it to a Boolean. And that happens using the Truthy and Falsy value rules that we just discussed in the beginning. So we know that money here is 0, but 0 is a falsy value, right? And so in this logical environment here, in this condition, this number 0 will be converted to false, just like it happened here when we converted manually the 0 to a Boolean, right? So here this conversion to Boolean returned false. And here the exact same thing happens. Money is 0, and so 0 is converted to false because it's a falsy value. And as a result, the else block here is executed, and so on the console we see you should get a job. Now if we change this to something else, and it doesn't matter what number, let's say 100, then 100 is a truthy value. And so this means that this condition will be true, and so the if block will be executed. Want to see? Yes, indeed. Now it says don't spend it all. Great, I hope that made sense. And we can test this in another situation to make really sure that you understand it. So another use case for these truthy and falsy values is to check if a variable is actually defined or not. And this might seem like a weird use case, but you will see later in the course that it actually makes a lot of sense sometimes to test if something actually exists or not. So let's define a variable here as height, and then we can simply do this. If height, then let's run this code. Yay, height is defined. But if not, well, then just say height is undefined. Okay, so let's see the result, and again I will explain you why it works this way. And maybe you can already guess why it works this way. So can you try to explain it to yourself maybe? That would be a good idea to make sure you actually got the concept. But anyway, we know that height is undefined in this moment, right? Because we didn't assign it any value yet. And we know from our little list here that undefined is a falsy value. And therefore, just like before in the money here, this height variable here in this logical context will automatically be converted to a Boolean. And since height is undefined, and undefined is a falsy value, height right here will be false. Therefore, this block here will be executed. But now, if we assign something to it, no matter what it is, then we will get the other result. So now it's true, and so now this block here is executed. However, with this, we can actually run into a problem. So let's say that the height is 0 for some reason, and that's a perfectly valid number. But watch what happens when we run this code. Now we get again, height is undefined. So, why is that? And I hope you know the answer by now. Well, it's because 0 is also a falsy value. And so this one will also trigger this else block. But in this case, that's actually not what we want. So this is kind of a bug. It's an error in our application. Because here in this if-else statement, we didn't account for this scenario. We only accounted for the scenario that the height is either defined or not. But we didn't think of the height being 0, right? And so right now we get height is undefined, even though that's not true. So this is just to illustrate an example that there can be problems using this approach. However, we can fix this using logical operators, which is going to be very interesting, and we will talk about that a little bit later in this section. But first, in the next lecture, we need to talk about equality operators. So stay tuned for that.